Hi guys, this is Mrs. Homer, and today we're talking about the selection graphs. So the first way that evolution can happen is through a process called natural selection, which we learned about in the last unit. And so we just want to review natural selection and how it works on what we call polygenic traits, or traits that have a variety of outcomes. So as you remember, natural selection, if a trait is good for the population, it's going to allow that trait to be passed on and become more common. And if a trait is bad or makes you less fit for your environment, that trait's going to eventually disappear or become less common. So natural selection is a mechanism that makes organisms better suited to their environment. So eventually we'll learn to think about natural selection or remember it with our thumb. Thumbs up, it's a good trait and you win, you survive, you reproduce. Thumbs down is a bad trait and you're going to die off or become less common. Okay? So there are three ways that natural selection can work on a population in terms of a trait that has a variety of outcomes. So from small, medium, large, or white, gray to black. So there's a bunch of different outcomes here in terms of the color. It's a variety. And so when you have a trait like this, it's called a polygenic trait, you're going to see this bell curve. And there are three ways that natural selection can work on this bell curve. The first one is called directional selection. In directional selection, one of the extremes, so the extremes are on the edges, okay? So these are traits that are not very common in the population, so you won't see them as often. But in directional selection, one of the extremes becomes more fit for the environment. So that trait makes that organism able to survive and reproduce, which means they're going to pass on their trait and that trait is going to become more common. Whereas the other two are going to start to decline because they're not as good or as fit for their environment. So what happens in directional selection, when one extreme is favored, we have a shifting in the graph in one direction. The second way that natural selection can work on a trait that's polygenic is called stabilizing selection. In stabilizing selection, the average is favored. So an average is best, which means the extremes are going to start to decline and the average is going to increase. So an increase in the average, a decline in either extreme will make this graph much more narrow and tall. Now, this does decrease the variation in the population because we don't see those extremes anymore. We're only seeing the average. And that can actually be harmful in terms of evolution for long term because if the environment changes, you don't have the variety to be able to adapt again to that new environment. So this is stabilizing, where the average is best. The last one is disruptive. And this one, the average is actually selected against, meaning the average trait makes you unsuited for your environment and you're going to die. Instead, both extremes, so the small and the large in this case, both extremes are more fit. They're selected for. And so we're going to see both extremes increase while the average declines. And so the new graph is going to have two bell curves now, one at either end where the extremes are. So in this case, the extremes are both good. So that's disruptive. So three types of selection: directional, disruptive, stabilizing. It helps when you're looking at a scenario to think of these in terms of who is surviving, who is the most fit for their environment, who is reproducing and passing on their traits. In directional, it's one extreme. One side of the graph is most fit and will survive and reproduce, and we'll see that move in one direction. In stabilizing, the average is most fit, and so the average is going to become more common, and we're going to see a narrowing of the graph. And in disruptive, both extremes are going to be fit, and both extremes are going to survive, and the average is going to die off. So you'll see those two different bell curves on either end. Okay. So we're going to take some time to answer some questions to make sure that you can apply these three types of selection graphs to different problems. All right, so let's go over the first 4 questions that you just answered. In the first one, the lizard population, the black and the white lizards, which are both extremes, are able to hide on the rocks, but the intermediate, that average color, the in-between color of gray, can't hide as well and gets eaten by the predators. And so the extremes are going up, the average is going down. That is disruptive. Both extremes survive. In the next problem, a bird species laid an average of 4 eggs per nesting season. But if you did too many or too few, the eggs did not survive as well. The babies didn't survive. So average was best. And when average is best, we'll see stabilizing. The average will survive. Number 3 was a little tricky because in the first scenario, the ice ages, the black bears increased in size, but then between the ice ages, the black bears decreased in size. But in both cases, it's always moving in one direction. One extreme is where we're seeing the graph move towards. So this is called directional. And number 4, the quiver tree population in Namibia evolved to survive on very small amounts of rainfall. So we would expect there to be small, medium, and large amounts of rainfall. But in this case, the plants that could handle small amounts of rainfall survived. And so we'll see a shift towards small amounts of rainfall, and that would be directional. It's one extreme on one side of the graph. All right, try the next few questions. All right, in number 5, a population of field mice. We had the coat color that ranges from light tan to dark brown. And those medium colors are increasing. They're found in great abundance because they can blend in. So they're surviving, they're doing really well. That's the average. And when average does well, that is stabilizing selection. Number 6, for Darwin's finches, the birds with a medium-sized beak, in this case, attract fewer mates. So instead of the average being good, the average is bad. And that means both the large and the small are good. And so when the extremes are good, that is disruptive. Both extremes survive, but the average dies off. And for number 7, when the two extremes are favored, that is, again, an example of disruptive. All right, one last set of questions. All right, for number 8, we have these cacti, and the number of spines will determine their ability to survive and reproduce. So if you have too few or too many, they're not going to reproduce as well. And so the average is good. And so when the average is good, that's called stabilizing. The average survives. In number 9, we have an environment that has high rainfall that makes these small seeds more common. Well, if you have a smaller beak, you're able to eat those small seeds. So we're looking at the beak size from small, medium to large. And the smaller beaks are better, and that is one extreme. And so the graph will shift towards the smaller beaks, and that is directional. And lastly, the most common type of selection that results in a high degree of similarity. This is stabilizing because more and more of the population becomes average. You have less variety, and it is the most common. All right, so that's all for the types of selection. You can go on and move on to your next activity. Have a great rest of your day.